residency creative writing program here at PNCA at Willamette. We have the first of 3 evenings of readings by our thesis candidate students in our incredible inaugural class of creative writers who are about to get their master's in fine arts. So tonight we have 4 readers. Tomorrow evening, we will also have 4 readers. And then on July 3rd, we will have 5 readers, and that's at 5 p.m. If you will post the link to the attendees for the readings that are happening tomorrow and Saturday. Without further ado, I would like to introduce a student of the cohort 22. That is, she's within her, she just finished the first year of her creative writing program. Rachel Keller, extraordinary fiction writer, will be introducing our thesis candidate students. Take it away, Rachel.
So excited to hear from all the readers tonight. First up, we have Jeremycushman. Jeremycushman is a nonfiction writer from Lincoln City, Oregon. He holds a bachelor's in English literature from the University of Oregon and a master's of arts in theological studies from Portland Seminary. He'll be reading an excerpt from his thesis titled Sacred Visitations. Everyone, please just give a warm welcome to Jeremy.
Cool, thank you. And just as a heads up, I do mention the Iraq War and PTSD, just in case anyone, if that bothers anyone, to kind of maybe mute me for a while. What I'll be reading from, yeah, my thesis, but the sections that I'm highlighting, I shift perspective a couple times, so it might be a little, it looks better on paper, so it's a little bit different for audio. Here we go. As the morning light crept through his window, Jeremy tossed and turned in his sleep. In his mind, he was running frantically through a shadowy, thick forest, as if something or someone were chasing him. His legs twitched in his bed as he ducked and weaved behind trees and bushes in his sleep. It seemed that at every step, the shadowy presence gained while his legs grew tired. Eventually, his legs felt like tree trunks being dragged through quicksand. The harder he tried, the slower he moved. His heart raced as the shadow began to overtake him. Trying to scream, he opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Yet as he looked forward with the silhouette looming behind, he was captivated by a symbol etched into one of the trees in front of him. It appeared like a bird outlined in maroon with wide wings. Its beak pointed to its left, and 2 turquoise ovals beneath its wings, as if protected by them. Though he could sense the shadow on his heels, Jeremy remained transfixed by this symbol. He glanced back. A hand reached out to grab him. He wriggled and wreathed, but the hand seized his entire body at the shoulder. Screaming silently toward the symbol, he heard the shadow's voice say, "Jeremy," and then awoke to the sound of his alarm buzzing from his phone. Startled, Jeremy sat up, gasping for air and covered in sweat. His left hand was placed on his right shoulder where he had felt the shadowy figure grab him. Even though he knew he was awake and what he experienced was a dream, he was stunned by how real it all felt. The crashing through the bushes and debris as he fled through a forest, the bird-like symbol that now seemed to glow in his memory, and the silhouette grabbing him and saying his name as if they were right there in his room. But Jeremy had lived alone for several years, and his apartment door locked automatically. Despite sweating through his clothes, he shuddered at the thought that his apartment might be haunted. They'll say you're making things up. They'll say you're just another conspiracy theorist. And they'll say you're just leveraging your skin color to get an advantage in a politically correct society. But this tells you more about them than it does about you. They assume you have selfish motives because all they have ever known is selfishness, utopia, manifest destiny, the American dream. Their cherished stories and ongoing propaganda narratives all reflect their desire to elevate the self at the expense of others, even their own kind, even their own children. They don't want to secure a future for their people. They want to eradicate all others. Let's see. I have to scroll a bit. That first night without his mom was one of the scariest Jeremy ever had. He cried most of the night and all the next morning, which eventually attracted unwanted attention from one of the other foster kids named Brian. At age 5, Brian was much taller than 2.5-year-old Jeremy, so when Brian took his bottle, the only familiar item he had from his mom, Jeremy started screaming out for help to no avail. He had tried for hours to get it back, but failed every time. When he finally gave up, he curled up into a corner facing away from Brian to cry, wishing his mom would come back. While he sobbed into his pajama bottoms, he heard a loud smack, followed by a heavy thud. He wiped his eyes and turned around to see another boy handing him his bottle. Behind this boy, Brian was curled up on the ground crying, holding his face in his hands. Confused but relieved to have his bottle back, Jeremy grabbed it slowly, looking up at the other boy, sporting a satisfied grin. "My name's Sydney," he said. Jeremy looked him up and down, figuring he must have been a little bit shorter than Brian, but is equally as wide. Sydney donned a short-sleeved, buttoned-up shirt that was tucked into his tan pants. "You can call me Sid," he said, helping Jeremy to his feet. "Welcome to our home." Jeremy sat at his desk, looking at the name Sidney Phillips on his Skype contacts list, thinking of that day that they met. It was impossible for him to forget the first person to ever stick up for him, because he knew for sure it had never been and would never be his birth mom. And while adoptive siblings can often be pains in the ass, Sidney truly was the brother he never thought he'd have. "What's going on?" Jeremy said as Sidney's face appeared on the screen. "Not much. How are things with you?" "Good for the most part, weird for the rest." Jeremy went on to explain the good part was how work was not as chaotic as it often was, even though it was becoming more stressful. They talked for a bit about possible career changes for him that didn't involve sales, but nothing seemed too promising for what he needed to cover rent. Then they started talking about their parents and as asking them both if they were planning on coming home for Thanksgiving that year, to which they both reluctantly said yes. While Jeremy loved the moments when Sidney would visit from San Antonio, where he was stationed in the Air Force, their parents were a little weird and deeply religious. There's always some spiritual element to Thanksgiving Day, and all Sidney and Jeremy wanted to do was watch football and eat food. But one of Jeremy's favorite things about these rare visits with Sidney was how often they'd play cribbage. In between holiday visits, though, they relied on a digital form of the game. "So what did you need help with?" Sidney asked as a new hand was dealt. Jeremy paused for a moment to figure out where the best place to start would be, then said, "Do you believe in some type of, I don't know, premonitions?" "You mean like getting a vision of something that may or may not be real?" Sidney asked, pausing their game. "In a way." Jeremy went on to explain the illusions he had been seeing in his reflection, where he'd seen them, and what he thought they might have meant. He left out no detail and was sure to describe the variations between sightings. After he was finished, he saw Sidney looking off to the side of the camera, lost in thought. After several moments, Sidney asked, "Have you been getting enough sleep? I know how it sounds, and yes, I've been getting a regular amount of sleep." And it was just then that his dream came back to him, seeing the silhouette of someone approaching him, and with the bird with two ovals under its wings. "Wait a minute. What's going on?" Sidney asked. I was getting my regular amount of sleep until last night." "What happened last night?" "Not sure exactly, but I had a dream that I was being chased." Sidney just stared at his camera with one eyebrow raised. "Or maybe I was just running. I don't know," Jeremy added. "It was like this shadowy figure wanted my attention. I didn't really feel threatened by them, but I was afraid of knowing who they were." "Okay, this is going to be some spooky shit," Sidney said. "But it does remind me of a buddy I had in Iraq." "Yeah?" "His name was James, and our first week over there, he was having these hellish nightmares. Some guys thought it was PTSD, but that's usually what happens when someone comes home from the war. We were hardly there a few days before they started happening. And what James did was when he woke up from the nightmare, he immediately started writing in his journal, describing where he was and what he was doing in the dream. About 2 weeks later, he tells me that he figured it out. Before he left for Iraq, he had a really bad argument with his brother, and in his dream, he was trying to talk with his brother to reconcile, but his brother couldn't hear him. No matter what his dream self tried, he couldn't speak with his brother. As the dreams kept happening, James figured out that it was because in the dream, his brother had died." "Whoa," Jeremy said, suddenly feeling the hairs on his neck tingle. He leaned back a moment in his chair and glanced over to his bookshelf to see his leather-bound journal sitting on the bottom of a oh my gosh, sitting at the bottom of a stack on the top shelf. It was a gift from his adoptive parents after he graduated high school. It had his name engraved on the front and Bible verse on the back, but it was where he would process a lot of stuff that happened in college. "Guess I'm not done processing," he thought. So shall we continue your ass beating and cribbage? Or, Sydney said, jarring Jeremy back to his computer screen. Yeah, I'm not that far behind, asshole. And that's all that I've got.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeremy. Our next reader is Eric Lilac. He is a perennial Portlander, aspiring novelist, and soon-to-be graduate of the Low Residency Creative Writing Graduate Program at PNCA. His essay, Comics Without Superheroes, The Literary Value of Graphic Novels, was published in 2014 by The Artifice. His postgraduate plans include the finalization and publication of a series of fantasy and science fiction novels. He currently lives in Milwaukee, Oregon, with a stray cat that adopted him. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to Eric.
Yes. Hi, thank you for that intro, Rachel. You may hear my cat in the background. Zoom drives her nuts, so bear with me on that. So I'm going to read an excerpt from my thesis, just kind of some side info here. The main characters in this piece are Quin and Templeton. Quin is partially elf and Templeton is partially dwarf, just to kind of give some reference to these characters. And there is some racial tension in this piece, so just be forewarned. Quin and Templeton walked with the elves for several hours before Eltine stepped through the twisted darkness of the core wood and onto a ridge looking down onto a valley. I welcome you to Sylvaeus, Eltine said as he gestured for Quin and Templeton to join him on the cusp of the ridgeline. In the valley below them was a forest unlike Templeton had ever seen. Where the corewood was unrelenting in its darkness, this other forest, Sylvaeus, was bright and effervescent. The trees in the valley grew tall and straight. Their highest boughs rose to the level of those of the trees atop the ridge. The needles and leaves on the trees in the valley were bright with colors of autumn, but some boughs were laden with blue needles, bright as the summer sky and dark as the sea. Others were an iridescent purple. Still other trees carried leaves and needles of silver. The air rising from the valley was crisp and smelled of cedar and daisies. A wide stream cut its way through the valley, its course running slowly enough to allow the surface to clearly reflect the thick grass along its banks and glisten with the waning sunlight that shone through the open canopy. Templeton wished to speak, but found words would not come. Instead, he felt all the worry caused by Chezzer and the danger he presented lift from his overburdened shoulders. He looked up to Quin, but didn't see the same wonderment in his expression. Quin's face was pained, the muscles in his jaw flexed tensely. Eltine began down the embankment into the valley. The footpath, worn into the dirt and rock, only allowed for single-file descent. Templeton nudged Quin when it appeared he wasn't going to follow. Quin started with a stuttered gasp, his enchantment broken. He looked down at Templeton. "What are you about?" Templeton asked in a hush. Quin inhaled deeply, taking his first breath since Sylvaeus came into view. "Nothing," Quin replied, and fell in behind Eltine. As Templeton stepped onto the footpath, the remainder of his elven escort stepped back and silently vanished into the forest. As they reached the bottom of the pathway and stepped into the valley, their boots met soft grass. Their footfalls made no sound. Wading through the thick grass and daisies that grew in the valley, Templeton was taken aback by the elves he saw. Never had he experienced a gathering of elves such as these in his life. The elves, unique as the forest around them, adorned their hair with vines of moonflower, campsis, bougainvillea. Many of the women wore gowns interwoven with variations of wisteria and golden veil. The men wore breeches accented with silverthorn, tunics embellished with ivy, and jerkins of a leather, which Templeton was unfamiliar. Little elflings chased each other and played along the banks of the stream, while the adults milled about this proper city grown from the earth itself. The three crossed the stream by large flat river stones that joined the two shores. The children playing along the banks of the stream paid them no heed. Once on the other side, Eltine stopped and turned to address them. "Here I will take my leave. May you find Sylvaeus as hospitable to you as the greatest cities of men," Eltine said, and despite the wonderment he felt earlier at seeing Sylvaeus, a familiar foreboding crept back into Templeton's consciousness as it did whenever he entered a large city, or a small village for that matter. Hospitable, Templeton thought. He hadn't found any town to be hospitable for many years. Meet me back here as the sun sets, Eltine continued, and I will lead you where you seek. But if the tower is hidden from you, know that I will take Isabella at her word and bring you before the wood soul. Eltine put his fist to his breast and bowed slightly to Quin. He then looked to Templeton and gave a quick nod of his head in parting. With a flourish of his cloak, Eltine turned away, leaving Quin and Templeton to their own devices. The hell's Quin? Templeton said in a stout whisper once he felt Eltine was safely distant. Quin seemed enchanted again, staring at his surroundings with a wandering gaze. Templeton tugged on Quin's sash. What's wrong with you? You haven't been your ne'er-do-well self since we got to this forest. Quin blinked and looked down at Templeton. He seemed confused, as if he were seeing Templeton for the first time. Quin's expression changed as he came back into himself. Recognition shone in his eyes. A wan smile crossed his lips. I've never seen a true elf-raised city before, Quin said with a touch of bewilderment. Sylvaeus may be the last one left. What are you going on about? Templeton was confused. There are elf cities all over the kingdoms. Yes, but cities raised with humans are occupied after the fall of the dwarves, Quin replied. Before that, this was how all elves lived, at one with the green that birthed us. Well, that birthed them. Will we be safe here while we wait? Templeton fussed. Quin's apparent unease was hastening the return of his own trepidations. Quin shrugged and smiled. I will be. His smile held a bit of familiar confidence, but Templeton noticed Quin's eyes didn't reflect the mirth that smile was meant to convey, only a worrisome ambivalence. Whether that ambivalence was born of some sense of fear that Templeton suspected Quin was battling, or something else, he couldn't be certain. Come on, I'd rather not just stand here waiting for Eltine to return, Quin said, and made his way into the city. Templeton stood back a moment and watched as his companion walked away. He began to think that the uneasiness he felt creeping back wasn't his own. He shook his head and followed after Quin. As they moved deeper into the city, Templeton was even more taken by the atmosphere that encompassed him. Above him, the boughs of the trees were decorated with crystalline hangings in the shape of raindrops and chrysalis, cocoons and spider webs. Leafless branches extended from tree to tree and intertwined to form bridges. Templeton noticed large openings in the trunks of the trees that appeared to be entrances to dwellings. Large mushrooms growing from the bark were used as balconies and windowsills. On the forest floor, the dwellings were made of moss-covered earthen mounds. He wandered to a tree and touched the bark of its trunk. It was softer and far less rough than he imagined it might be. His foot brushed against a leaf that had fallen. It was a pinkish color, its texture smooth and rigid. Templeton held it up to the sunlight. It was as if he were looking through stained glass. The urge to tuck the leaf into his vest gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. He took a breath and placed the fallen leaf back on the ground with a gentle reverence. The city's avenues were blanketed in thick green grass. No paved streets or dirt pathways existed. There was a bustle not only on the ground level of the city, but in the upper boughs of the giant trees as well, with elves crossing from tree to tree on the many levels of limb bridges above him. Lamps inside the tree dwellings and grass-covered earthen hollows glowed with the soft yellow light of fireflies and the bright blue-white light of lightning beetles. Music emanated from many of the dwellings. Various soft melodies were being plucked from the strings of lute, lyre, harp, and other instruments, whose hypnotic tones Templeton didn't recognize. He absorbed his surroundings, unaware of the subtle expressions of disdain he drew from the citizenry. Then his nose caught the scent of sweet fry cakes coming from a long earthen hall. A sign made of white bark hung above the entrance and was inscribed in a language he didn't recognize. Do you smell that? Templeton asked, his eyes sparkling with anticipation. Quin shook his head. What? Templeton replied. We haven't eaten since morning, except for that bit of pear you stole. You have to be as hungry as I am. I'm never as hungry as you are, Quin said. Templeton shrugged and walked through the open doorway. Inside the longhouse were several high stone tables. Most were occupied by elves, but Templeton saw a few humans as well. The humans wore shirts and trousers of common linen, and he assumed these humans were villagers from Woods Hollow. Glass lanterns holding dozens of lightning beetles hung from the ceiling. Blue-white light emanating from the thumb-thick thoraxes of the shiny blue creatures, lit the interior space. Along the far wall was a bar made of halved logs that appeared lightning scorched. Behind it, several young elves scurried back and forth, tapping kegs and filling mugs. One elf, with skin the color of wet earth and thick silver hair that was pulled into a braid that fell just below her waist, gestured the two to come sit at the bar. Quin and Templeton took a pair of stone stools in front of her, the tops of which were concave to perfectly support their users' backsides. "Haven't seen the two of you before," she said as she set a pair of tankards in front of them, the tops crowned with the thick head of a deep golden brew. Now that he was closer to the elf, Templeton could see the shirt she wore was stretched tight against her strongly muscled arms. The beginnings of crow's feet were noticeable at the corners of her eyes. Templeton had never seen an elf with crow's feet. She cast a glance at Templeton as he took in the sight of her. "Much to our disappointment," Quin replied to her with a wink and a smile, gaining only a raised eyebrow accompanied by a look of antipathy from their hostess. Templeton took a drink to quell the chuckle that rose in his witnessing Quin's failed flirtation. His eyes went wide as the drink hit his tongue. Never had he tasted an ale that sang on his palate and alighted his spirit as this brew had. He pulled the mug away from his mouth, the head leaving a residual mustache on his upper lip. He slowly swallowed the mouthful of liquid, savoring the experience as it flowed down his gullet and nestled into his belly. He blinked twice and looked up at their hostess. She crossed her arms and glowered at him. Do you approve, Pavi Motram?" she asked. Templeton nodded, but Quin shifted in his seat. Templeton did not know the elvish insult, as it was spoken in a language he didn't comprehend. What he did understand, though, was the expression on her face, but not the reason for its appearance. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Eric. Our next reader is Brian. Brian Moore, Zay Zem, is from Ontario, Oregon. Zay wants to say thank you for everything. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to Brian.
Hello, everyone. So the first piece I'm going to read is called Dresses. I've been feeling a fair bit of dysphoria today, so I thought I would start with dresses. When I started wearing dresses, it felt like an answer. Oh, was my sound okay? This sound okay?
Yeah, your sound's good.
Thanks. When I started wearing dresses, it felt like an answer to my awful boy clothing. I've always felt like I dressed so badly, and each dress felt miles ahead of any piece of clothing I'd owned for myself. My dysphoria often feels like an escape from being gendered as a boy. Green rich girl dress. It was hunter green. Looking upon it was calming to me. It was like the high-end bags I'd seen at the mall. It had 2 buckles on the waist, both gold-colored, and the buttons were matching and decorated with repeating circles. I wore this with a modest, loose-fitting white top. The dress was reminiscent of a trendy redhead traveling for the summer. The plain black Ayn Rand dress. Most of my dresses were bought from the same thrift store in Alaska. My friend Azara had assured me that often tourists had to dump high-end clothes in order to make it back to the airport. I call it my Ayn Rand dress because Azara told me that Ayn Rand had spoken of a time where the most power she had ever had was in a plain black dress with a thin silver chain. I'm not quite sure I can validate the story. Nevertheless, I needed a dress to wait tables in. I was very thin. A binder was a must for the bottom half. I had a small bra at the time, and the dress seemed to exaggerate me as feminine by the way it set over my breast-like protrusions and my stomach. The dress was my most confident dress, regardless of if Ayn Rand had actually worn it. Faux Mormon jean dress. A jean dress I had found while digging through some old thrift clothes my mother had. I had come back from Alaska with some new clothes, but I needed something rugged. I was sifting through an old dresser, which I gather was the new container for any clothes my mom had found at the Salvation Army. I found the short jean dress that had a pair of shorts sewn into the bottom. It was a relief to find something that didn't need a tight latex pair of shorts underneath to conceal my penis. It was a very comfortable dress and went well with most of my dress shirts. My first floofy turquoise dress / skirt. Bought from a strange store chain, Rue 21. I think this is where all the leftover clothes from the Kesha era ended up. There was a fake flashy jewelry and cheap alternatives to expensive name brand mall clothing. It was thin polyester with a stretch band holding it to my waist. I guess it would be more of a skirt than a dress. Still pieced together with everything I wore with it, it felt like a proper dress. My black yarn body dress. A very thick, armless dress. It was concealing, but it constricted movement of my legs, so I didn't see much wear. It resembled something made of yarn, but was very tightly knit. My lumpy turquoise thrift dress. I bought this from a store called the Royal Clothiers. It was a very huggy dress. I had just started cross-dressing. I admit my body wasn't well put together for something like it, but I wore it with a huge hat and a bag, and it didn't look awful. Hand-me-down friend's dress. There was a clothing exchange between a bunch of people in the theater program. I had just started to cross-dress, so it was a moment to be accepted. My friend Kelsey handed me the dress, telling me that she had loved it before she had stopped fitting into it. I was at my thinnest, so I was happy with it. It was argyle with a black piece of fabric at the neck. It was low cut, so I found myself wearing it with something skin tight underneath as to not reveal my broad, pale chest. The argyle was an alternating blue and darker blue with accentuating lines of a different shade of blue highlighting the diamonds. The dress was worn and stress fabric pilling in little white spheres. The back of the dress in the lower section, the frill, was plain black and extended down to the beginning of my knees. We had a good friendship off and on, and it wasn't awful. The dress was my favorite because it was representative of our friendship. The best part was the straps. They were thin, almost reminiscent of overalls, best worn with a latex undershirt or a small bolero. Cross-dressing frontier dress. Often for comedic effect in community theater, you are asked to cross-dress for a role. The dress was probably designed for an ensemble, some sort of little Bo Peep. I would guess that it was purchased for a production of 7 Brides for 7 Brothers. Overall, it was unmemorable. I think of the blonde curly wig I wore with it before the actual dress. Perfect gothic dress that would have fixed my entire life had I fit into it. The dress is probably representative of every social media platform I've ever been drawn to. It was cottage goth, which means white lace, long sleeves, but not coquettish enough to be European. My friend's hoarder mother had presented this to me. It was the nicest dress I had ever seen. I actually think that's all of them. The rest of my girl clothes were very skinny jeans and tight shirts I would wear with unbuttoned shirts that showed off my petite bra. That was back when I could smoke weed and could work out for hours without feeling fatigued. I'm starting to think absence is abuse. I didn't, all right, now I'm just going to move on to the next piece. This piece is called Crying. I heard the word and started to think about the time I accompanied my friend Richard to an AA meeting. It was a somber day and I hadn't really noticed how upset I was getting. A few of the stories and the absolute desolation I heard from the group made me relate. I cried into the couch as Richard patted my back. I think I cried a lot then. It was the second year of estrogen and T blockers, but I wouldn't attribute it to that. It just comes up. I remember it being a few sobs and then feeling tears break through. It was very light and viscous. I think about being in that apartment a lot. That was 6 years ago. I've been alone since then. I've tried to think of the times I've cried this year. Mostly the silent tears that build up don't come out consciously. There were many times I could feel it, but it wouldn't come out. An acting coach used to say that I'd lose that ability. I must be special. There was this one time in an acting exercise that I was so eager to cry that I really stirred myself too much and overdid it. It makes me writhe in embarrassment. I haven't ever had to cry on cue, although I've definitely been able to access it when acting. I just haven't had to fake it. I would cry now, actually. It's very easy for me. It's such a common faculty, and I hardly understand it. I had a conversation with an internet personality where we had the common experience of taking pictures of ourselves when we cried. I've done it before. Thinking about that picture, it's either kind of cute or hideous. I've probably cried in public enough that many people have ceased association with me because of it. I know I've been ridiculed for it. One time when I was young, my family had teased me to the point that I was sobbing and I sounded like a goat. I guess I could talk of the different types of crying or what emotions brings it forth the most. Truly, it must be sadness, even shame, which would identify as its own entity, still seems to derive from sadness. I've wondered if I'm the sort of person who inflames it for my own enjoyment, that I need the highs and lows to entertain myself. I really wouldn't say so. It's all felt so awful. Every time I cry, it feels like I'm punching myself in the face. I've literally had times where the tears unconsciously bring my hands to my face with such force that I can feel it for a few days. It's like that Melanie Martinez song, Cry Baby. I've definitely been called that by my cousins, by my friends, sisters, parents. I felt like crying for my brother-in-law. It's been awful to think about losing a father. I'm dreading the time when my father is in hospice. He's already expressed his sentiments that he doesn't want to die. This is due mostly to his panic over his health. Once, I sat in this really nice bar we had in my college town, and after a fight with a girl, drank vodka while weeping. Even talking about crying makes me feel like crying. It's so easily transmittable. I don't think I'm ever going to be done crying. If I had to decide right now how I think of it, I would say that I feel ridiculous. It makes me think of the sad clown. I remember when this caught on in our friend group, one of my friends and I were particularly miserable, and he agreed. We were sad clowns. Sometimes it gets locked up in my face, and instead of crying, I just have to let it out of my mouth, moan or sob. At that time, I usually wish I was crying. It's obscene. I used to like the imagery of being so sad that the subject vomits. It does cause nausea. I felt the revulsion build up, and I've heaved, but nothing expels. I do think some people are beautiful when they are sad, but in practice, I'm more likely to move away. I'm ashamed. I remember saying in a conversation once that I can't cry anymore. That was a little true at the time, but I still felt ridiculous. I think I said that I haven't cried for years. It hasn't lost meaning despite the frequency. I'm just self-characterize myself as a sad person. Things will mostly go the way in which I look dopey or a drink has capsized in my lap. My friends used to call it being a sad sack, which is shorthand for a sad sack of shit. When I break up with a person, I usually start crying too. One of my favorite moments of intimacy was laying there within just over a minute ago, X. I just stayed with her and held her gently as she gently cried. It's kind of a gross topic, like finding a worm in your room. I feel like crying now, but I'm not gonna, an ex of mine used to say. I'm a fairly imitative person. Tears and lip curling, vomit and bile. Even though I failed many times to hide tears, I think it's very easy to have one escape or cry into your hands and no one will notice. Usually it sneaks into my voice, and that's the main giveaway. I remember when we were watching monologues and this girl began to sob during a monologue where she called her ex-boyfriend a black hole. I think I cried less when I smoked pot a lot, which was probably afforded to me out of sympathy. I feel like now I could use a good cry. I probably won't. I'll probably avoid crying. I have a few ways to put it off. Dead silence. Makes me feel awkward. I just imagined my friend Madison crying. I think I've seen that before. I have a list of friends who I could categorize as depressive. I don't see these people, though. I have a hard time connecting. You have to be in something that has immediate vicinity or we can't be around each other. I just remember Madison throwing up in the sink. I ended up in a shower scream crying that party while my friend Cody held me. I was being rejected a lot. That happened a lot that year. I was drinking a lot more. It was probably not that way. I just remember it that way. Drinking and crying is probably my favorite activity. There are so many things I can't change, so I just feel the emotions instead of getting a clean resolution. I spent a lot of time just making myself feel better. I don't know how to deal with it, honestly. I've known so much world sadness as it was that it creates more guilt the sadder I get. I've been diagnosed with monopolar depressive disorder before. I think crying is better than staring off into nothing. I think that's the more dangerous mode of being sad. You can't think, and everything is just stale and blank. I feel so guilty. I could choose a song and easily start crying now. Music is such an easy trigger for me. If I want to feel moved, or if I want to feel something affirming, I can cry that way too. My tears are salty. They change temperature quickly. They are surprisingly full for how little they seem. It feels like I'm crying a flood, but it spatters in small amounts. They are better when they are warm. They are miserable when it's cold. I feel so ashamed. I would rather be distracted. I think at this point, I will stop writing in silence and turn on some music. If I were someone that knew me, I'd be so used to it by now. I'd be so used to seeing his friend of mine just go back and forth between being fine and massively upset. A few of friends just see me as a character now, someone who is akin to a cartoon. I guess that's evidence that my personality is attributed to my form. It's not a fact that it's inherent. The first playlist I have on Spotify is called Cry More. I've thought of making a poem from song titles before. The problem with that is they all sound like titles. A map, a string, a light, breed, Peggy, Ola, Erica Western Teleport, Wool in the Wash, Crying, Aries, Stay Ugly, Life in Drag, Sleeping Lessons, Promises, Sorrow Doesn't Resurrect, Pray for Pills, The Waterboy Returns. 2. Don't Call Me Peanut, A Familiar Place, Among the Wildflowers, Gum. You are the answer to my security question. Avalanches, We Know Where You Sleep, Ontario Gothic, Holy Ghost, Your Deep Rest, I Think You're Really Beautiful. 3. 2814, Forgetting Days, Don't Move, Teenager. I used to try really hard to train myself to get just a few tears while singing a Broadway ballad. I had to have my voice coach train me not to get emotionally attached because I'd sound like I was choke sobbing. I think I was made fun of before for being like a teenage girl. I'm almost feeling silent again. I've got plenty more to think about. It's mostly been stories. My tears are rapid, frequent, feels like eye straining. I can feel myself have difficulty swallowing. It's guilt this time. It's fair to say that I've let quite a bit go in my life, but so much remains. I would rather be angry. I've cried out of anger before. The first time I've ever tried to fight someone was when I was so mad that I was crying. I was 9 or 10, maybe 12. That was when I started going to the Mormon church a lot. We didn't go to services. I remember falling asleep in the church a lot, but that was at the Fellowship Church and the Nazarene Church. I can easily track this. I don't cry when I get fired, though. I don't cry when I lose my apartment. I don't cry when I lose at games. I don't cry when I fail a test. I don't cry when I get hit in the face. Once during a stage combat scene that went wrong. It's fair to say that I'm sheltered at this point. I guess my most dramatic crying scene had to be when I had lost a sports competition in high school. I had my only opportunity to place first at a tournament in my 4 years at high school. I lost and had a very loud, obnoxious crying fit in the locker room. It was very public. I say this out loud now because it is embarrassing. I was 18. I think I've definitely oriented myself better now, although I do excuse myself for my age often. I'm about to turn 30, and I'm very ready to blame every emotional outburst on my middle age. I've always thought everything was ridiculous. I haven't touched on the actual weighted tragedy that I've cried over, the things I've mentioned in my other writings, and that's mostly because I don't remember. I've shelved it so hard that I do not even remember what I felt. I perhaps even didn't feel it in entirety once. I couldn't be that sad as a child. When I was the youngest, I just cried when my father left the house. Other than that, everything was beyond my scope of designation. I think if I had a choice, I'd never cry again. I think the most upset I've ever been didn't cause tears. It caused nights of teeth grinding and hopeless whimpering. Then it caused anger when I realized that the sadness and hopelessness were by someone else's intention. They had wanted me to be upset as possible to manipulate events to their advantage. It's such a weakness. I've known all along I had it, but knew there wasn't much I could do to prevent it. This makes me think of Dandelion Hands, which is the name of the band. I'm going to use the name as a poetic prompt. Dandelion Hands, preemptive detachment. It's easy. Removal, silhouette, ruthless, transference, delays, no more hunger, stay in bed, rude, unaware, ignore, don't think about it, suicide, global, delays, traffic, smoked sky, dead hand, no, it's for someone else, leave her alone, go away, comfort, seeds, disruption, separation, wrong, admittance. Can it be a poem unless I've spent time reviewing the draft? This makes me think of Angels in America. I love that play. I feel like both the Mormon housewife and the crossdresser dying of AIDS. I don't intuit well. It's something you learn after you've thrown your first theme party. It's all been done before. Something inside me is rotten. You're dancing as fast as you can. I actually do feel sick of thinking about it. I'm probably going to be busy today. It's usually just business until one of my less healthy distractions is replaced. If I have no depth, then just let me rest. Okay, I think I've just taught myself for most trivial cry. I had $20 left in my account, and I had spent it on wine for me and my best friend girlfriend at the time. I fumbled the bottle in the main room of the basement I was living at the time, and it shattered against the concrete floor. I actually cried in front of my best friend / girlfriend. It was so much guilt that bubbled over due to how irresponsible I felt. She was having trouble paying rent too. I could have just given her the $20. I could have just let her stay with me. Fuck. Fuckity fuck fuck. Oh well, it wouldn't have mattered anyway. I met the love of my life later that year, and it would all be irrelevant. It's probably the most selfish thing about me. So much more crying to come. My funny friends in high school would say, if you have an issue, here's a tissue. My sister Diana usually just calls me a mama's boy. I watched her cuddling her son the other day. It has a whole new meaning. I've cried while watching Twilight by Stephanie Meyer. I'm just out of things to say. I've exhausted myself.
Thank you so much, Brian. Our next reader is Rowan. Rowan Solana is a graduate of Marylhurst University, where she completed a self-designed undergraduate degree in interdisciplinary studies. The core of her creative work is engaging somatically with narrative through self-guided rituals, focusing on the therapeutic capacity of narrative as a tool with which to heal and grow from trauma. Writing and creating through ritual is one way that Rowan approaches and expresses her experiences of being disabled and living with chronic pain. Today, she will be reading from her thesis, Murmurations, which is a collection of poetry composed through somatic rituals. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to Rowan.
Thank you, Rachel. Before I read, I wanted to provide a little bit of context for the poems I'm reading. All of the poems from my thesis are untitled and intended to be read in a continuous fluctuating movement, like the body of Dancing Starlings the manuscript is named for. For tonight, I've selected 7 poems to read, along with the benediction that closes the manuscript. The varying use of pronouns is intentional, and that's an integral aspect of my thesis work, which gestures towards the dynamic of a murmuration, in which many bodies move together as one. There is a way of making alchemy work. If I make a casket from the branches of my arms and lace it with the purple flowers coiling my clavicle, I can build my body inside the body of my daughter, her eyes, my eyes. If I say through the shallows, curtaining the confessional between us, I am here. Will she hear? Look at me, I want to murmur in her ear. Look at me, I am there in your shadow, in your reflection, in your unclosing crown. I am in every horizon, the ripples of blue glass, in the tender kiss of the breeze, in the whispers of trees and stones, and the life swelling in between. Come, the blue sagebrush beckons us to stand upon the threshold of the throat. See, the bucket from the well sags from its brim with burdensome shadows. Listen, the willows beat their wings against the windows, pale and swallowing sharp curtains of rain. If we are runaways, then it is to a wilderness of our own design. A magpie with huckleberry eyes perches upon a rail of light. The crescent canopy rustles across the trailing veil of velvet twilight, pooling at our knees. It is the voices of trees hushing the world to sleep, whispering, "You will touch daylight again." My sister's courage resting beside mine. White, dusty terror rattles inside my body, Bach anointing the dying lamplight. I begin a new ritual, framing decaying horizons with all their rain-soaked soaring of the light. The crest is up ahead, where you will lay down the burden of your father, where you will stretch your weeping eyes to the cusp of the horizon, where bruises deepen and become soil that drinks from a harsh wind, where lupines whisper lacerations and blood becomes salt water, tugging you into the arms of your mother. Someday this shore will grow distant. The sand you keep heaping into your hands, the rocks you beat your body against. Someday this shore will be distant, like all the others you couldn't bear to leave, hazy and dwindling upon the frail edge of a pale horizon. Moonlight crawls across the porch, shedding opal rhododendrons and clarity. Your mother unfolds into the kitchen chair across from you. You cannot hear her voice, but she is telling you that this is the filling. This is where your feet are washed and then respun. Benediction. We will reach the mouth of where the world is opening to us. We will see the grace of starlings again, brushing the same violet sky. We will swallow seawater like it is medicine and return with open palms. We will collapse only to shrug our way out of old skin when we grow our wings. Do not mistake our thirst for peace for any kind of mercy, nor the planets dancing from our fingertips as any kind of fancy. We will become a harbor for ourselves when we have had our fill of swallowing storms. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rowan. Thank you so much to all the readers for their incredible work and to everyone who attended. This is such a great first night. We can't wait to see you all tomorrow, Thursday at 7, to hear from Casey Anderson, Wendy Battles, Olivia Fishwick, and Jen